December 30th, 1943, 6:17 hours. Royal Air Force Kimballton, Huntingdonshire, England. I remember the cold first. Not the theatrical kind spoken of in memoirs, but the practical cold of an English winter morning on an exposed bomber station. A wind moving unhindered across dispersal hardstands, carrying moisture that settled into metal and bone alike. Frost clung to the aluminum skins of parked aircraft. Ground crews worked without hurry, yet without pause. No one lingered. The engines had not yet started, but the airfield already held tension. One could measure it in distances: 600 yards between briefing huts and aircraft, 40 paces between men walking in silence, 10 seconds spent studying a clipboard before climbing into a machine that might not return, that the target lay beyond the Ruhr industrial region. Deep penetration. The route planners had drawn a line across occupied Europe that intersected known interceptor concentrations. Luftwaffe response was expected early and in strength. Escort fighters would accompany the formation across the Channel and into Belgium. But fuel mathematics, not optimism, dictated their withdrawal before the bombers reached the most dangerous airspace. This was not unusual. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force had grown accustomed to operating alone over Germany. I watched one particular aircraft crew prepare beneath dispersal lamplight, a Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress, olive drab, worn by weather, exhaust staining the wings, frost outlining rivet lines. She carried nose art applied by steady hands weeks earlier, a name repeated from a previous aircraft lost to flak damage beyond repair. Crews often preserved names when machines could not be preserved. Continuity mattered inside that aircraft. Moving through the fuselage toward the rear was Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, 24 years of age. Army Air Forces enlisted gunner, assigned to the tail position, the most isolated station aboard the bomber. The geometry of the aircraft dictated this solitude. From nose to tail measured over 70 feet. Aluminum frames, oxygen lines, ammunition feeds, and bulkheads separated the gunner from the rest of his crew. Communication came only through interphone. Physical assistance was impossible once airborne. I note these conditions because they shaped decisions later, attributed to character or instinct. In aerial combat, environment governs behavior as much as training. Aerith wore standard electrically heated flight clothing over wool layers, parachute harness already attached. His helmet carried integrated earphones. Goggles rested against his forehead. A throat microphone allowed speech without raising one's voice above engine noise. Such equipment was not comfort. At altitude, outside air temperatures commonly approached -50 degrees Celsius, electrical failure or exposure meant frostbite within minutes, incapacitation soon after. The tail compartment itself allowed little movement, roughly 4 feet across, slightly longer and aft, enclosed by plexiglass panels. 2.50 caliber Browning and M2 machine guns extended behind him. Each weapon belt-fed from ammunition boxes secured beside the mounting frame. Sights were mechanical. No radar assistance, no stabilization, no automation. Engagement relied on estimation, distance, closure rate, lead angle calculated in seconds, while another aircraft closed at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. This was considered defensive armament. It rarely felt defensive. The 8th Air Force had learned, often through loss, that German fighter doctrine favored approach from the rear hemisphere offered the longest firing window. From 6 o'clock position, an interceptor pilot could align weapons, correct aim, and fire sustained bursts before crossing beneath the bomber's structure. Tail gunners, therefore, absorbed initial contact more frequently than any other crew member except those positioned in ball turrets. Statistics from mid-1943 were stark. Average life expectancy for heavy bomber crews measured in missions, not months. Replacement training cycles were continuous. Aircraft losses occurred often enough to be discussed in briefings without ceremony. Survival depended on formation, discipline, mutual defensive fire, and escort protection when available. Yet doctrine evolves slowly when institutions seek predictability. Standard gunnery instruction emphasized ammunition, conservation, engage only at short range, fire deliberate bursts, confirm solution before committing rounds. The logic was mathematical: ammunition, supply finite, engagement opportunities numerous. The classroom did not account for cannon shells arriving first. I had seen mission reports documenting the consequences. German fighters equipped with 20mm autocannon could inflict catastrophic structural damage in seconds. Plexiglass shattered, control cables severed, oxygen systems compromised. A gunner who waited precisely as instructed might find himself unable to return fire at all. ARU was not alone in noticing this disparity between doctrine and survival. But on this morning, he had resolved to act upon it with unusual consistency. At 6:42 hours, engines started. One after another, right cyclones coughed, ignited, stabilized into synchronized vibration. The sound filled the airfield. It was mechanical, relentless, oddly reassuring. Ground crew signaled readiness. Taxiing began. Snow remnants along the perimeter lights reflected propeller wash. Takeoff intervals were measured and deliberate. A heavy bomber required runway length and patience. When the aircraft carrying Arath lifted into low cloud, condensation streamed briefly along wing surfaces before dispersing into the gray morning. Climb continued in wide formation circles over eastern England. Bombers assembled into combat boxes, layered defensive geometry designed to maximize overlapping gun coverage. Aircraft positions were predetermined. Discipline reduced collision risk and improved collective survivability inside the tail compartment. Aerith monitored sky sectors through clear panels, now frosting at their edges. Oxygen flowed steadily through his mask. The interphone carried routine exchanges, altitude confirmations, engine checks, navigation updates. These communications were calm by necessity. Emotional displays held little operational value. Crossing the English coastline marked transition from preparation to exposure. Over the channel, altitude approached operational level. Condensation trails formed behind the formation, visible signatures detectable at great distance. Concealment was not possible. The mission relied instead on altitude and defensive concentration. Escort fighters joined as scheduled. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts maneuvered alongside their presence, altering enemy engagement calculations. German interceptors rarely pressed aggressively, while escorts remained nearby. Fuel endurance, however, imposed limits on protection. This arithmetic range versus coverage influenced bomber crew psychology profoundly. They understood precisely when isolation would begin. It began over Belgium. Escort aircraft signaled departure through wing motion and radio acknowledgement. One by one, they turned westward. The bomber stream continued alone. I have read many accounts describing this moment. None exaggerate the shift in atmosphere. Without escort, anticipation sharpened. Crew members spoke less. Observers searched cloud layers and horizon. Lines for movement inconsistent with wind or altitude. Aerith adjusted ammunition feeds. 800 rounds available between his two weapons. He had already adopted a personal deviation from formal instruction. Engagement at greater range. Suppression rather than reaction. This was neither impulsive nor theatrical. It was a calculation derived from observed enemy behavior across previous missions. The first interceptors appeared as distant specks below contrail altitude. Gradual enlargement confirmed approach. Formation discipline tightened instinctively. Gunners tracked assigned sectors. I note here the importance of silence. Engines constant, interphone restrained, because clarity of observation depended upon it. At 11:09 hours, the initial attack developed from low 6 o'clock. Messerschmitt, Bf-109 fighters climbed toward bomber altitude, presenting narrow frontal profiles that broadened as they approached. Conventional instruction would have dictated waiting. Aerith did not wait, he fired. Tracers extended outward invisible. Arcs long before German pilots reached their preferred firing distance. The rounds were not immediately destructive. They were disruptive. Interceptors adjusted trajectories sooner than anticipated, breaking attack geometry. Some rolled away. Others fired prematurely. The defensive effect, though subtle in any single encounter, accumulated across multiple engagements. I observe this not as romantic defiance, but as tactical variation. Air combat doctrine often evolves through such individual deviations long before official acknowledgement. Throughout that mission, and those that followed, the pattern repeated: early fire, increased ammunition expenditure, reduced firing solutions available to attacking fighters. Whether coincidence or consequence, the aircraft carrying Arath returned repeatedly by autumn. Similar techniques appeared in reports from other gunners within the group. Adaptation spreads quietly in combat environments. Survival evidence outweighs written instruction. On subsequent missions, Luftwaffe pilots adjusted. Approaches steepened. Speeds increased. Attack angles diversified. The exchange between offense and defense remained fluid, each side studying the other through debriefing and observation. No advantage remained permanent. It was within this evolving contest that the engagement occurred, the one later simplified into numerical summary. 17 opposing aircraft destroyed across cumulative sorties. Attribution in aerial warfare is complex, yet confirmations existed within gun camera analysis and formation witness statements. They were not achieved in a single encounter, nor through spectacle, but through repetition of calculated aggression under extreme conditions. I resist presenting these outcomes as legend. What matters historically is not the tally itself, but the environment producing it. Isolation, mechanical vulnerability, doctrinal tension, and the constant negotiation between restraint and initiative. By late winter, the bomber force had integrated revised engagement, guidance permitting. Extended range defensive fire when conditions justified. Institutional acknowledgement followed empirical observation. As it often does in wartime, Aerith continued flying. Cold mornings repeated, engines repeated, distance repeated, waiting repeated, and each mission carried the same uncertainty, not whether fighters would arrive, but whether timing, ammunition, and judgment would align. Once they did, that alignment would be tested again over Germany, more severely than before, and on one mission in particular. The margin between calculated aggression and fatal exposure would narrow to seconds and to a handful of remaining rounds. February 20th, 1944. Altitude WWII 10 feet. Eastern approach corridor toward central Germany. I recall the clarity of that morning sky above the cloud deck, an austere blue, unbroken by weather and therefore unbroken by concealment. Visibility extended for miles in every direction. Such conditions favored interception. There were no storms to scatter formations, no haze to mask contrails, only distance, altitude, and the certainty of detection. The 8th Air Force had expanded its reach considerably by this stage of the air campaign. Bombing missions were no longer tentative probes. They were sustained penetrations intended to degrade industrial capacity and strain defensive resources. German fighter control systems. Integrating radar warning networks and ground-directed interception responded with increasing coordination. Aircraft were vectored efficiently toward bomber streams long before visual contact. Inside the tail compartment, Sergeant Aerith operated within familiar constraints: limited space, continuous vibration, oxygen-fed breathing, frost creeping across panel edges. These physical constants changed little from mission to mission. What changed was expectation. Experience teaches pattern recognition. Gunners learned to anticipate timing between radar contact and visual engagement. They learned the silhouettes of incoming aircraft. They learned, too, the difference between routine threat and concentrated resistance. At 7:19 hours, contrails formed beneath the formation at lower altitude, converging vectors characteristic of organized fighter ascent. The interphone carried calm confirmation from dorsal gunners observing the same development. Crew coordination remained disciplined. Excitement had no operational utility. Only clarity mattered. Within minutes, the first attackers resolved into identifiable shapes. Bf-109 variants approached in pairs, exploiting altitude differential to accelerate into firing position. Their engines left thin exhaust traces against the sky. Range estimation in such moments was not academic. The difference between 900 and 600 yards governed decision timing. ARU engaged at extended distance again. The Brownings produced sustained recoil through the mounting frame, vibration transmitted directly through his flight suit and harness. Tracer intervals allowed visual correction. I have examined gun camera records demonstrating how early engagement forced German pilots to maneuver prematurely, losing alignment necessary for effective cannon bursts. This disruption did not eliminate attacks. It complicated them. 2 passes were broken before reaching optimal range. A third interceptor pressed closer, firing briefly before rolling away trailing smoke. Confirmation of destruction would come later through formation observation, yet the immediate operational outcome remained unchanged. The bomber formation continued intact. Minutes stretched, engagements followed rhythm dictated by fuel endurance and vectoring cycles. Interceptors arrived in waves, withdrew, regrouped, returned. Ammunition counters declined incrementally. This arithmetic consumption against remaining threat distance weighed constantly upon defensive gunners. At 7:46 hours, a more aggressive approach developed. Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters climbed rapidly from below. Heavier armament, granting them destructive capability within short firing windows. Their radial engines and wing structures gave them distinct visual presence. Broader, more imposing, though identification consumed only fractions of seconds. Aerith opened fire before they stabilized. One aircraft rolled sharply away. Another maintained course, exchanging fire that produced audible impact against fuselage skin forward of the tail position. The sensation was not explosive. It resembled violent hammering transmitted through aluminum framework. Structural integrity held. Instruments remained operational. Engagement ended. The formation pressed onward. I note here the psychological dimensions seldom emphasized in operational summaries. Fatigue accumulated invisibly. Adrenaline surged repeatedly, then receded. Oxygen flow dried the throat. Gloves stiffened. Eyes strained against glare and vibration, yet attention could not lapse. In tail positions, observation was continuous responsibility. There were no natural rest intervals beyond the brief absence of visible threat by mid-mission. Cumulative engagements had altered tactical atmosphere. Interceptors exhibited increasing caution toward rear approach. Some shifted toward oblique vectors. Others coordinated multi-angle attacks intended to divide defensive fire. This adaptation demonstrated reciprocal learning within the air war, an exchange conducted without communication yet unmistakably observed. Aruth's ammunition reserves diminished accordingly. Extended range fire consumed resources rapidly. By 8-10 hours, remaining rounds were significantly reduced. I emphasize the neutrality of this observation. Tactical initiative always incurs cost. The measure of effectiveness lies in outcome rather than economy. The bombing run itself demanded straight and level flight. Predictability imposed by targeting requirements, such predictability invited concentrated interception. German fighters exploited these intervals habitually. Defensive gunners, therefore, bore heightened burden while maneuvering capability vanished. It was during this phase that the engagement occurred which later drew particular analytical attention. An interceptor approached directly astern, maintaining course despite defensive fire from adjacent aircraft. Aerith held aim correction through incremental adjustments, releasing controlled bursts as range closed. The closure geometry favored accuracy once alignment stabilized. Impact flashes became visible along the attacker's engine housing. The aircraft entered uncontrolled descent moments later. Confirmation followed through witness reporting. That action represented another increment toward cumulative tally. No celebration accompanied it. There was only immediate reassessment of ammunition, sector scanning, and preparation for subsequent threats. Return transit across occupied territory introduced further engagements. Though intensity diminished with distance from primary defense concentrations, fuel limitations constrained pursuing fighters. Gradual reduction in contact allowed crews to transition from acute tension to sustained vigilance. Landing procedures later that day proceeded without incident. Post-flight inspection revealed scattered structural impacts but no critical failures. Debriefing officers collected engagement accounts with characteristic procedural restraint. Ammunition expenditure was noted. Observed results logged. No dramatic commentary entered official record. Over successive missions, similar patterns emerged. Extended range engagement disrupted approach cohesion. Enemy pilots displayed increasing hesitation toward tail convergence. This behavioral shift, documented across multiple crew reports, contributed to gradual doctrinal reconsideration within operational planning sections. Yet, effectiveness did not imply invulnerability. Adaptation from opposing forces continued. By spring, interceptors employed higher-speed slashing attacks designed to minimize exposure. Some exploited sun positioning, others coordinated simultaneous vector convergence. defensive advantage remained provisional. During one later sortie, the mission often identified as the culminating episode, concentrated resistance exceeded previous encounters. Interception began earlier along the route and persisted deeper into withdrawal phase. Aerith entered that engagement already aware of declining ammunition and mechanical strain accumulated across repeated firing sequences. He maintained position. Engagements unfolded across nearly an hour. Ammunition counters approached depletion. Weapon barrels heated despite frigid external temperatures. Communication among crew stations conveyed structural damage elsewhere in the formation, reinforcing awareness that defensive success remained collective rather than individual. When final rounds were expended, Aerith continued observation with inactive guns, a circumstance recorded in post-mission narrative. German fighters, recognizing absence of fire, closed distance cautiously before diverting toward alternate targets. The aircraft returned damaged but intact. That mission marked the conclusion of his operational tally, reaching 17 confirmed aerial destructions, attributed through corroborated assessment procedures of the period. Such attribution remained imperfect science, yet cumulative documentation supported recognition within official commendations. I consider this figure less instructive than the procedural influence that followed. Tactical analysis within command structure incorporated evidence demonstrating effectiveness of earlier engagement under specific conditions. Revised guidance disseminated thereafter permitted greater discretion. Among defensive gunners regarding range initiation, institutional doctrine had shifted, not through proclamation, but through aggregated observation of survival outcomes.ar. Youth himself did not continue indefinitely in combat status. Physical strain, exposure, and injury effects accumulated as they did for many aircrew. Reassignment to instructional duties followed completion of operational tours requirements. There he transmitted experiential knowledge to replacement personnel preparing for European deployment. I have reviewed training materials from that period showing emphasis on situational judgment rather than rigid adherence to distance thresholds. Such evolution reflects broader wartime pattern. Procedure refined by experience, purchased at cost. His subsequent service extended beyond immediate conflict. Career continuation within post-war air service structures illustrates an individual trajectory not uncommon among those who found identity within military institution after prolonged operational exposure. Historical memory tends to compress, lives into single episodes. Aircraft destroyed, medals awarded, numbers recited. These abstractions obscure the quieter reality of repetition, mornings of preparation, hours of vigilance, incremental adjustment of behavior within unforgiving environment. I observe, when examining archival film and reports, that the true significance of such individuals lies not solely in personal tally, but in contribution to collective survivability and procedural evolution within strategic campaign. By mid-1944, improved escort range and continued tactical refinement altered bomber loss ratios across many operational sectors. Multiple variables influenced this outcome, yet defensive gunnery adaptation formed one measurable component within that equation. 17 aircraft destroyed is therefore not merely a statistic, it is an index of engagement within a broader adaptive contest between opposing air forces, conducted across altitude layers invisible from the ground yet decisive in shaping operational capability. The final portion of this account turns toward aftermath recognition, memory, and the quieter conclusions that follow conflict's intensity. Those moments carry less kinetic drama yet reveal enduring perspective. September 3, 1944, 16:28 hours, 8th Air Force Administrative Section, Eastern England. I note the time because by then the rhythm of operational flying had altered. Escort coverage extended deeper into German airspace. Bomber formations benefited from long-range fighter support that had not existed during the earlier months of the campaign. Loss rates, while never negligible, reflected these changes. Technology, logistics, and tactical experience had combined to shift the balance incrementally. Staff, Sergeant Michael Aerith no longer occupied the tail compartment of an operational aircraft on that afternoon. His flying status had concluded weeks earlier. The result of cumulative medical evaluation following sustained exposure, injury, and strain. Such transitions were rarely dramatic. Paperwork replaced engine vibration. Debriefings replaced contrail observation. War moved forward regardless. Recognition arrived through official channels in language both formal and restrained. Citations documented conduct under hostile engagement, endurance despite wounds, and the confirmed destruction of multiple intercepting aircraft across successive missions. Decorations followed procedure rather than spectacle. The administrative tone of these records contrasts sharply with the physical reality they represent. Ink on paper rarely conveys altitude, cold, or velocity. I have examined such citations often. They tend toward brevity, as though compressing violent experience into orderly paragraphs might impose coherence upon it. Aruth's record, listing 17 confirmed aerial destructions with additional probable claims, places him among a small number of defensive gunners, whose engagement outcomes were extensively verified through witness corroboration and camera evidence. These confirmations were not assigned lightly. Wartime evaluation boards required concurrence from multiple sources before acknowledgement, yet the figure itself, while notable, does not fully explain subsequent institutional attention. What drew analytical interest was the tactical behavior associated with those engagements. Extended range defensive fire, previously discouraged, except under unusual circumstance, appeared repeatedly within debriefing notes. Correlation between that approach and successful disruption of interceptor attack geometry warranted examination. Gunnery training syllabi, distributed within certain heavy bomber units, reflected subtle revisions. Language shifted from prohibition toward conditional discretion. Trainees were instructed to evaluate closure conditions, formation spacing, and ammunition status when determining engagement initiation distance. This was not formal revolution. Military organizations seldom adopt abrupt doctrinal reversals during ongoing operations. Instead, adaptation appeared through amended phrasing, revised emphasis, and instructor commentary grounded in combat experience. Aruth's reassignment placed him directly within that instructional environment. The transition from combatant to instructor requires adjustment, often overlooked in historical narrative. The individual who had once observed enemy aircraft through vibrating gun sights now faced classrooms of young airmen who had yet to encounter altitude or hostile fire. Authority rested not upon rank alone, but upon credibility established through operational record. Accounts indicate his instructional style emphasized clarity and practicality. He did not romanticize aerial engagement, nor did he discourage caution. He described timing, observation, discipline, and the importance of initiative when survival calculations demanded deviation from expectation. Students carried those lessons into theaters beyond Europe. By war's final year, bomber operations extended across multiple regions. Personnel turnover ensured transmission of experiential knowledge across units and continents. Such diffusion rarely appears dramatic in archival material, yet its cumulative effect shaped operational competence on large scale. When hostilities concluded in 1945, demobilization released many airmen from service. Aruth chose otherwise. With establishment of the United States Air Force as independent branch in 1947, he continued in uniform. Post-war service records describe assignments unconnected to the intensity of European air combat. Administrative duty, logistical coordination, routine responsibilities characteristic of peacetime force, structure-filled subsequent years. To some observers, this continuation appears curious, yet numerous veterans maintained affiliation with institutions that had defined their early adulthood. The transition from structured purpose to civilian uncertainty did not appeal to all. He remained until retirement in 1962 at senior non-commissioned rank. The intervening decades passed largely outside public attention. Marriage, family life, community involvement, these constituted the majority of his later experience. Accounts from contemporaries suggest reluctance to dwell upon wartime episodes. Medals were stored rather than displayed. Such restraint aligns with broader generational patterns among combat veterans whose service predated modern culture of commemoration, memory. However, persists beyond personal narration. Former crew members gathered periodically through veterans associations. Reunions served both remembrance and reconciliation. Within such settings, stories resurfaced, fragments aligning into collective narrative. Aircraft names spoken again. Missions recalled. Absences acknowledged. These gatherings formed informal archives of emotional history, supplementing official documentation. Preservation of record also occurred through institutional channels. Air Force historical divisions archived mission reports, gun camera reels, and training memoranda. Museums curated surviving aircraft and artifacts. Scholars examined operational datasets to trace evolution of doctrine. Through these mechanisms, the experiences of individuals like Aerith entered broader, historiographical understanding of strategic air warfare. He died in February 1990, age 70. Burial followed military custom, headstone inscribed with name, rank, and service dates. Such markers maintain austere uniformity. They do not enumerate aerial victories. They do not recount altitude or temperature. They do not describe the isolation of a tail compartment or the sound of machine guns vibrating through structural frame. Yet they signify participation in events of national and global consequence. I have stood within museum displays containing preserved B-17 aircraft, observing visitors move through fuselage walkways toward tail sections scarcely wider than a person's shoulders. Many pause in silence once inside. The dimensions alone communicate more than extensive narration. They suggest confinement, exposure, distance from assistance. Within such space, historical abstraction acquires physical form. From an analytical perspective, the operational significance of Aruth's actions lies not in mythology of individual invincibility, a notion unsupported by archival evidence, but in demonstration of adaptive response within dynamic combat system. The air war over Europe represented continual exchange of tactic and countermeasure. Radar detection, guided interception. Formation defense, concentrated firepower. Escort range extension, reduced vulnerability. Gunnery initiative further complicated enemy approach. Each development influenced outcome incrementally. 17 confirmed aircraft, destroyed by one defensive gunner, did not alter war's trajectory alone. But the behavioral patterns underlying those engagements contributed to collective refinement, enhancing survivability for others. History frequently advances through such aggregation of individual decisions enacted under pressure and later institutionalized through observation. I reflect on the phrase sometimes attached to accounts of his service that German fighters could not stop the bomber he defended until he had destroyed 17 of them. It is a compelling construction, yet requires careful contextualization. Bombers were lost. Crews were killed. Airspace remained contested. What the phrase truly conveys is persistence within hazard continued operation across repeated exposure to organized interception and measured effectiveness within those encounters. The closing assessment must therefore remain balanced. Evidence supports recognition of tactical initiative, confirmed combat success, and influence upon training perspective. It also demands acknowledgement of environment shared by thousands of aircrew whose experiences ended differently. Historical respect arises not from elevation of singular narrative above collective experience, but from integrating individual example within broader human and operational framework. When I review mission chronologies and personal records together, I observe recurring elements: mechanical noise preceding departure, prolonged waiting at altitude, brief intervals of violence measured in seconds, and return flights conducted in silence broken only by instrument readings. Such cycles defined existence for those engaged in strategic bombing operations. Within that rhythm, individuals made decisions affecting themselves and others. Some of those decisions entered record. Many did not. Michael Aruth's entered record. His presence within the tail of a B-17 on multiple winter mornings contributed, in small but measurable degree, to survival of aircraft and evolution of defensive understanding. That contribution endures within archival data, within training lineage, and within collective memory preserved through scholarship and remembrance. I conclude not with spectacle, but with recognition of scale. Vast campaigns are composed of singular perspectives observed through small panes of plexiglass, measured in seconds of judgment and yards of distance. History resides there as surely as in headquarters directives or strategic maps. In the end, one man in an exposed compartment, watching empty sky behind his aircraft, altered his response to what he saw. He acted repeatedly. He survived long enough for those actions to be noted, and because they were noted, They remain part of the record we continue to examine, quietly, carefully, and with the respect owed to those who occupied that narrow space between doctrine and survival. If you loved this story and want more history that shocks, inspires, and motivates, subscribe to Rising Warfare, like this video, and explore the incredible tales we uncover. More amazing content is coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss it.